Good morning, afternoon, evening, or whenever you're watching this. My name is Professor Ferrero, and we are going to continue on in our lecture series over U.S. history, 1877 to the present. Today, we are going to be going over the populist movement of the late 1800s. Before we jump straight into that, though, quick recap of what we talked about last lecture. We talked about the closeout of the West. We also talked about a lot of the corruption present in the United States during the Second Industrial Revolution and the Gilded Age. That's lecture 5.1 if you want to go back and watch that over the Gilded Age, and lecture 5.2 if you want to watch the video about the closeout of the West. Today we're going to be talking about the populist movement. Populism is a ideology that doesn't necessarily have to be liberal or conservative. Really, it just appeals to the common man. We've seen populist movements in recent history. As of recording of this video, it's 2025. If you think back to the election of 2020 in the Democratic primaries, Bernie Sanders ran as a populist. He appealed to the common man and say, "Hey, you know why you're down on your luck. It is because of big pharma. It is because of big companies taking advantage of you, the common working man." It's emphasizing the average Joe over the elites. And similarly, Donald Trump is arguably a populist figure as well. He himself often isn't necessarily pointing to the necessarily super rich as the issue, but as politicians and bureaucrats and these other unelected officials and elected officials alike, that they are making your life harder, that they are making you the enemy, and ultimately he's there to stick up for you. So, as we get into today, we're going to first be going through a variety of presidents. So, I always go through the presidents. I think it's always helpful to know who's president during what times. Just gives us a sense of grounding. I do it in my lessons on 1877 back, and I do it on 1877 moving forward. Not all of these guys are all that important, but it's important to touch on all of them just to give us a sense of where we are in American history. So, Rutherford B. Hayes. Not a whole lot to say about this guy. Arguably one of our worst presidents, in large part because he's going to be the president who ends Reconstruction in the South. Post Civil War, the American South is occupied by Northern troops. Following the assassination of Abraham Lincoln, Andrew Johnson is going to become president, and then followed by Ulysses S. Grant. Both of those presidents are going to oversee Reconstruction, and the radical Republicans in Congress are going to really advance a lot of rights for African Americans down in the South. Ultimately, though, the election of 1876 is going to be a really, really hotly contested one. And it comes down to a couple of states where it's kind of a bit of a gray area as to who should get the electorates. If they go to Hayes, he's going to become president. Hayes basically cuts a backroom deal with the Democrats. The Democrats, more than anything, the Southern Democrats, more than anything, want the Northern troops out. So Hayes basically promises, if you make me president, I am going to pull the troops out of the South. And he makes good on his promise. He's going to be a one termer by choice. He chooses not to run again. And ultimately, he's going to start rebuilding the Republican Party as the party of big business. The Republican Party, originally founded in 1850 as the Abolitionist Party. But after the end of the Civil War and the Reconstruction period, it's kind of a question of what is the identity of the Republicans going to be moving forward. And I'd argue, really, up probably until about 2016, the Republican Party has kind of been known as the party of big business, as being more pro business, business friendly, and arguably still is today. So he's going to go ahead and he's going to help cause that shift. That's going to lead us to our next president, James A. Garfield. I miss the days when presidents had good facial hair like that. Makes me a little sad. Let me go ahead and just show him off right there. So, Garfield had been a prominent Republican for quite a while. He had been in Congress since 19, or not 19, 1862, which is in the middle of the Civil War. Ultimately, not a whole lot to say about Garfield. If you look at those years, he's not even president for a full year. He is, I believe, our second shortest serving president. Ultimately, he is going to get shot at a railroad station by a bitter attorney in the back. He literally gets shot in the back. The attorney's angry that he didn't get the job. The bullet is going to hit him in the back. It's going to travel across his back, and they need to get this bullet out. Bullets back then are made out of lead. It's going to lead to lead poisoning. It's going to kill him. Hygiene also wasn't really a thing back then. So they're just jamming their finger in there. They're jamming a prod in there. They're making sure, trying to get the bullet out any way that they can. They want to make sure the president doesn't die to lead poisoning. Ironically enough, a cyst had formed around the bullet, keeping lead from leaking out into his body. Ultimately, if they had left the bullet alone, he wouldn't have died. However, he's going to die because they keep jamming their finger in that hole. They keep putting dirt and bacteria and grime into there. It's going to lead to it being infected, and he's going to die several months, I think it's a month to 3 months later, on September 19th, 1881. It's a really, really sad way to go. It's almost as if God was looking out for him and saying, "Hey, you're not going to die due to the bullet, but the doctors had other plans." So, not a whole lot to say about Garfield. He's not really one of our more important presidents just because of how shortly he serves. He's going to be followed up by Chester A. Arthur. Again, not a whole lot to say about these presidents, really, between Grant and McKinley. Arthur tends to be above the factionalism of politics. He tends to side with the Democrats at times. He tends to side with the Republicans at times. He ultimately tried to broker peace, I guess, between the two political parties. He's a really great example of somebody filling out his duty, and I think in many ways ought to be remembered as being a lot more of a commendable president than he was. His entire presidency, he's dying due to a fatal kidney disease. A news publisher at the time recalled when he was leaving office, no man ever entered the presidency so profoundly and widely distrusted. Basically, nobody trusted the man, and nobody left more generally respected. Kind of leads us to a question of what do we want our legacy to be? What do we want to be remembered for? Garfield was remembered as being a guy who nobody thought would succeed, but he went ahead and he did a great job at being president. So, just something to consider. I think there's a lot of reflection that ought to take place when thinking through and looking through history. So, that is Chester A. Arthur. Next is Grover Cleveland. Grover Cleveland's going to be our first elected Democrat since before Lincoln. Really, from Lincoln all the way up until FDR, you only have two Democrats. You have Grover Cleveland and you have Woodrow Wilson. Grover Cleveland, first Democrat elected after the Civil War. Ultimately, he's going to start to regulate the railroad companies. He tends to reduce tariffs, but he's going to lose the election of 1888 to Benjamin Harrison. Benjamin Harrison, we'll talk about him in a moment. What's important to note, though, around this time is the populist movement is gaining traction. Again, I mentioned at the start of the lecture, populism is a political movement that emphasizes the common man over the elites, speaks to the average Joe, and really can get a little messy sometimes, but kind of says your problems aren't your fault. And it's these elites that we need to go ahead and tackle and get rid of. Ultimately, the populist movement is going to emerge out of the Farmers Alliance. This is going to be an agricultural movement aimed at agricultural reform. Ultimately, the goal was to form a coalition to stand up next to big businesses and elites. If you remember back to our Gilded Age lecture, big business and politics kind of went hand in hand at this time. This is kind of the reform party of its time. They did manage to unite black and white farmers, and they also aimed to bring in factory workers as well. However, factory workers and labor activists are going to shift Republican. They're ultimately trying to push the government to regulate industry more hands-on. The poster child of the populist movement is going to be the man you see in the picture right above me, William Jennings Bryan. William Jennings Bryan, I kind of like to call him the little engine who couldn't part two. Uh, look, he's not the first guy to run for president a bajillion times and fail. He runs for president probably a half dozen times and fails each and every single time. He keeps trying to win the presidency, and he's never able to do it. Brian ultimately is going to advocate for the silver standard. It's a little bit confusing because our money today isn't backed by anything. A dollar is worth a dollar because the federal government says it's worth a dollar. But back in the late 1800s and really through most of the 1900s, the US dollar was backed by gold. So if you were to bring $50 in cash to the bank, in theory, you could exchange that for $50 worth of gold. The issue is gold is finite and it's hard to get more. So it limits the cash supply. It helps reduce on inflation, but it does keep money from entering the economy. It restricts that. Money doesn't enter the economy as easily if it's backed by gold. Ryan and the Populists are going to offer a solution. They say, let's not just do a gold standard, let's do a silver standard along with the gold standard, basically increasing the amount of money in circulation. They want to help those poor farmers. Ryan's never going to win. The Populists never win. We have yet to have a president that isn't from one of the two major parties of their time. But Brian does do, and the Populists do something that a lot of third parties do a good job of doing, and that is getting the other two major parties to kind of reorient around their ideology. The populist movement is going to shape the progressive era politics of the 1900 to 1920. So while they aren't able to get a whole lot done, their policies are going to shift the other political parties. We see that today with socialists and libertarians. Socialist Party tends to have a bit of sway within the Democratic Party, where libertarians tend to have a bit more sway within the Republican Party. You can see populist strength out in the country, and overall, there's not highlighter, my bad. There's really a lot more support out here in the Dakotas, in Idaho, Nevada, Colorado, Kansas. The issue is, though, is nobody lives there. So even though these states may overwhelmingly support the populists, these are not states that are going to win you the presidency in the Electoral College. So that is William Jennings Bryan and the populists. It's going to bring us to our next president, Benjamin Harrison. He's going to win the election of 1889. 1888. He becomes president in 1889. He's going to be one of our early presidents to run a front porch campaign. Put as simply as I can, front porch campaign is a presidential campaign where the president tries to seem relatable. He tries to seem approachable. Presidents do this today. When Barack Obama was running for president, he talked about how he grew up in a single parent household. When Joe Biden was running for president, he talked about how he grew up as a poor kid in Scranton, Pennsylvania. Even super duper uber rich, wealthy people like Donald Trump. Donald Trump goes ahead and works at McDonald's to seem relatable and approachable. I know that's a little bit reductive, but presidents, when they're running for office, tend to want to seem approachable. They want to seem relatable. They want to seem like you because that psychologically is going to make you more likely to vote for them. In terms of foreign policy, Benjamin Harrison has a very, very strong foreign policy, and he, along with McKinley, are going to be the presidents that really lead us into the era of American imperialism. He tries to bring Hawaii into the United States at the end of his term. However, since he does it so late in his term, it doesn't get through before he leaves, and the president after him is going to withdraw that motion. This is going to lead us to the next president, Grover Cleveland. Nani? Grover Cleveland is our first ever president to win two non consecutive terms. I actually had to change this lesson PowerPoint slide recently because this only recently changed with our most recent election. Ultimately, Grover Cleveland's going to break up the Pullman strike, and he, because of that, is going to be very, very unpopular due to that decision. And also, at the same time, an economic recession hits the United States, and he gets blamed for it. So this leads to the rise of unions. Unions started to form to combat Gilded Age corruption. It's used as collective bargaining. I talked about that in lesson 5.1. Basically, if I refuse to work until I get paid more, they're going to fire me. But if I and all of my coworkers and multiple people at other branches of the company refuse to work, then they're going to have to raise pay. Because if they fire all of us, they're going to lose out on a lot more money than if they raised our pay. This is going to lead to the Homestead Strike. This is one of the two really, really big strikes of the late 1800s. The Homestead Strike of 1892. It's going to revolve around Andrew Carnegie's Carnegie Steel. The company is going to go ahead and basically not be paying their workers enough. Most of these go about like that. The factory owner, the manager of that particular factory, is Henry Frick. All of his employees are off protesting. They want to come into the factory to protest. Frick knows about this. He's going to hire the Pinkerton Detective Agency to go ahead and guard the factory, keeping the protesters from coming in and protesting in the factory. Ultimately, the Pinkerton Detective Agency, they're hired guards. They are basically there to make sure that no people come in, and they are armed. That's where things get bad. Because they are armed, the protesters get into a violent altercation with them, and a firefight breaks out between both sides. Because of that, the strike is going to fizzle out rather understandably. The protesters abandon the strike because nobody wants to be shot at. I have no issue with you protesting, but I'm going to encourage you, if they start shooting, don't stay. Not wise. This is going to lead to the next major strike. Let me go ahead and move my face out of the way so you can go ahead and look at it. The Pullman Strike is going to start with the American Railway Union, created by Eugene V. Debs. Eugene V. Debs is a labor organizer, a labor leader. He's going to pop up a few more times in our lectures this class. The strike is going to start in Chicago due to wages being cut, and at the same time, the Pullman Company is cutting wages. They are also increasing the rent because they own the housing for most of their employees. It's aimed against the Pullman Company, and it begins in June. The Pullman Company being a railway company. Strikes are going to go ahead and spread across the country. Railroad workers start walking off the job, preventing the transportation of goods. It grinds everything to a halt. The strikers actually do start to get violent. They obstruct railroad tracks. They even threaten strike breakers. In Chicago, it gets very, very bad. They start flipping over train cars. They go ahead, stuff gets burned down, a fire is set, and fire trucks can't even get to the fire because the fire trucks are using the railroads that they're flipping stuff over on. They're derailing trains on these. Ultimately, it gets so bad that the US federal government steps in to break the strike. The federal government ends up siding with the corporations because of all the chaos that's ensuing. Ultimately, Eugene V. Debs, he's a Democrat at this point, but after this, he's going to flip to the Socialist Party. He's going to flip to the Socialist movement. Due to his involvement here, he's going to be arrested. Basically, the whole thing gets pinned on him. Here you see the Pullman strike. It's a cartoon. Again, I always encourage you to go ahead and pause before we break it down together. So, as you can see, here we have the Pullman Company. The Pullman Company is quite literally, if you notice what they're doing to their employees, they are literally squeezing the money out of their employees. How are they doing it? By lowering the wages. And what are they doing on the bottom end? They are raising the rent. So it's not just that they are paying them less, it's that they are paying them less, and then the housing that they live in, they are increasing the rent, basically forcing the employees to work more harder hours for the company or be left homeless. They really don't have any other options, which is why they resort to the Pullman strike. Along with that, you have increased discrimination down in the South. Ultimately, voting rights are going to be restricted during this time period. Post post end of Reconstruction, things get a lot worse in the South. Ultimately, due to the 14th and 15th Amendment, you can't technically keep somebody from voting based off of race. That's not allowed. They are going to come up with ways around that, though. They come up with things such as poll taxes. Basically, you have to pay a fee in order to vote. Which, unfortunately, since African Americans are coming out of slavery less than a generation before this, they're not really going to have the economic means to pay the poll tax. And they're not going to have a lot of economic opportunities because of discrimination as well. Another big way they do it is literacy tests. Basically, they have to pass a written exam that's not easy. Again, while it's not technically saying it targets black people, it does disproportionately affect them because education in the black community is far less well funded than in the white community. These targets towards African Americans actually do end up disenfranchising some poor whites as well. Poor whites who couldn't either pay the tax or who weren't well educated enough to pass the literacy test themselves. This is going to lead us to Plessy v. Ferguson. This is arguably one of the most important Supreme Court cases in American history, and not for good reasons. I would put this up there as one of the worst three Supreme Court decisions in American history, right alongside Dred Scott. Arguably, this is worse than Dred Scott because it lasted a whole lot longer, the effects of it. So, the story Homer Plessy. Homer Plessy is 7/8 white, 1/8 black. Homeboy probably looked like me. He looked white. We don't have pictures of him. If you look up pictures of Homer Plessy, it shows you a different guy who's 7/8 white, 1/8 black. Ultimately, Homer Plessy is trying to protest segregation in Louisiana. So what does he do? He goes ahead and he buys a train ticket. He goes ahead and he's about to sit in the white section. He lets them know, hey, by the way, I'm part black. They say, cool. You're not sitting in the white section. You're sitting in the colored car. Go ahead and go back there. Now Plessy has a court case on his hands. He goes ahead and he's going to sue. That's why it's Plessy v. Ferguson. He's the one who's suing. And in a tragic Supreme Court decision, 7-1, Supreme Court is going to rule that segregation is protected under the 14th Amendment, so long as the facilities for blacks and for whites are equal. Say it's legal under the Constitution. The lone dissenter of this is going to be John Marshall Harlan. This legalizes segregation moving forward for the next like 60, 70 years. At this time as well, down in the South, you see an increase in lynchings. African Americans, usually African American men, being accused of false crimes. Oftentimes it was rape charges of white women. More often than not, nearly all the time, this was a bare lie, just an excuse for mob justice to go ahead and lynch a African American, an innocent African American. So things they get a lot worse down in the South. Here you see educator Mary McLeod Bethune at her all girls school. She's going to be a pretty big player in education for African Americans. Again, you can just see how segregated it is. If you look, every single one of those girls is African American. And we talked about it in our westward expansion video, but these are the exodusters. A lot of people take the opportunity to use the Homestead Act to flee. Here you see the town of Nicodemus in Kansas, and it's an exoduster community. I honestly personally really love the picture of the guy like right there on top of the building. Just, you do you, King. This is going to be one of the two big civil rights advocates of the early 1900s, late 1800s, Booker T. Washington. He's going to be contrasted with his counterpart, W.E.D. DuBois. Booker T. Washington's going to advocate for basically black excellence. He's going to argue that African Americans should be so well educated, they should make so much money, they should be so successful, they should be in such high leadership positions that eventually whites will have to accept them. He argues do so well, do so great that they have to acknowledge your accomplishments and they have to treat you equal and they have to treat you fairly. Ultimately, Booker T. Washington's attitude towards civil rights is a very, very slow march towards progress. He is also going to be the first civil rights advocate to sit down in the White House. He's going to sit down with future President Theodore Roosevelt in the White House. Teddy Roosevelt's going to be the first president to invite a civil rights leader to go ahead and join him at the White House. And here is the other key player, W.E.B. DuBois. He's going to be the creator and the founder of the NAACP, the National Association of the Advancement of Colored People. He's going to be pushing against Washington's view of civil rights. DuBois is going to push for more immediate emancipation. He's going to call for more immediate, albeit peaceful, agitation and protest. While their ideologies don't quite line up, you can kind of think of them as the MLK and the Malcolm X of their time. Two individuals who have competing ideologies of how civil rights should be pushed forward. Ultimately, Washington is the much more moderate one, where Dubois is more of the agitator. That's not to say either of them advocated for violence or militarism like X did, but they do offer a stark contrast to each other. So we see here with the populist movement, we see here with the civil rights pushes that reform is kind of just on the cusp. But before we get to reform, we're going to have to go through the election of 19. Oh, I didn't want to do that. My bad. The election of 1896. The election of 1896 is going to be a landslide for William McKinley. And William McKinley is going to open the door for American imperialism. That is where we are going to leave off today with the end of the populist movement. It's a little bit of a shorter one again, but thank you guys for watching. If you have any questions and you're on one of my courses, please write it down and I will address it in the next class, next time we meet. If you aren't in one of my classes, thank you for watching. Please be sure to like and to subscribe. And go ahead and leave any comments about any questions that you might have here, and I will do to the best of my ability to answer. Thank you for watching. Take care and have a blessed day.